The dealer didn't even get out of his truck. He pulled up the lane, rolled the window down, looked across the yard at the old iron sitting in the tall grass, and shook his head before a single word had been spoken. 3 rusted mold boards, a worn frame the color of dried blood, chipped paint that hadn't been factory fresh since Eisenhower was in office. He glanced at the man standing beside it, then looked away, the way men do when they've already decided something and don't want to be talked out of it. "I'll be honest with you," the dealer said. "That thing's scrap. You'd do better selling it by the pound." The man didn't argue. He just looked at the plow the way you look at something you know and the other person doesn't. He nodded slowly, thanked the dealer for coming out, and watched the truck back down the lane and disappear. And that plow sat in that yard for another 3 weeks. Then it went to work. What followed would be talked about for years in that county, not loudly, not with fanfare, but in the way that real things get remembered, quietly, with a kind of stubborn respect. Because what happened in that field that autumn wasn't just about an old machine. It was about something the dealer couldn't have priced if he'd tried. And it started long before he ever rolled that window down. The land itself had been the problem for a long time. 42 acres in the low corner of the county, heavy with clay subsoil that had been compacted over 20 years of hard use. The kind of ground that looks manageable from a road and reveals its character only once you're committed to it. Previous owners had run modern equipment across it. Wide-body tractors, multi-bottom plows, everything current and financed and sensible. And every time, the results were the same. The machines would bog down in the wet sections, smear the clay instead of turning it, and leave the ground in worse condition than before. 2 consecutive tenants had walked away from their leases. The third one simply stopped farming at mid-season and pretended he hadn't. By the time the man acquired the land, through a private arrangement that raised a few eyebrows in the county seat, most people assumed he'd gotten a bad deal. The price seemed low enough to be a trap. The land had a reputation. A piece of ground that eats equipment and produces nothing is not an asset. It's a liability wearing the clothes of an opportunity. But the man had grown up farming clay ground. His father had farmed clay ground, and his grandfather, who had died at 91, still hard as a fence post, had once told him something that stayed with him the way certain things do, the things you don't fully understand until years later. "Wide iron tears clay," the old man had said. "Narrow iron talks to it." He hadn't understood it then. He was 12 years old and more interested in getting out of the field than learning anything about it. But the sentence had stayed, folded somewhere in the back of his mind, until the day he stood in front of 42 acres of compacted clay and heard it again like it had just been said. The 1958 plow had belonged to his grandfather. It was a 2-bottom pull type, a configuration that by modern standards looked almost primitive. Narrow shanks, a specific pitch to the mold boards that wasn't designed for speed or width, but for penetration and clean soil inversion. Built in an era when American iron was still made with a particular stubbornness, when tolerances were cut by machinists who had opinions about their work. The kind of machine that didn't try to do too much at once, and for exactly that reason did its one thing very well. It had sat behind 3 different barns over the decades, survived 2 estate sales, ended up in his yard partly by sentiment, partly by instinct. He'd loaded it onto his trailer at his uncle's place 8 years earlier, without being entirely sure why. His wife had asked about it twice. He'd said he'd get to it. Then it sat in the tall grass until the dealer came and told him it was worthless. What nobody outside his immediate family knew was that he'd spent 12 evenings in the month before that dealer visit taking that plow apart and putting it back together, replacing bearing surfaces, resetting the hitch geometry, checking the pitch of each moldboard with a level and a caliper, and adjusting until the angles matched what the original spec sheets, sourced through an old implement manual he'd ordered from an agricultural library, described as ideal for high clay soil conditions. He hadn't told anyone he was doing this. There was no audience for it. There was just the work and the reason for it, which only he fully understood. He was not a gambling man. He was a man who did his homework in private so that his results looked like luck to people who hadn't been paying attention. The day he hitched the old plow behind his tractor and drove it to the edge of that field, two neighbors were watching from the road. Not deliberately. One was checking a fence line, one was just passing, but they both slowed down, the way people do when something looks out of place, enough to be interesting. He didn't acknowledge them. He lined up on the headland, dropped the plow, and moved forward at a speed that seemed almost too slow to be useful. That was the first surprise. He wasn't racing. He wasn't trying to cover ground quickly. He was letting the iron work at the pace the iron wanted to work. The mold boards entered the clay at an angle that cut rather than pushed, narrow, patient, each bottom inverting a clean ribbon of soil about 12 inches wide, folding it completely rather than smearing it sideways the way wider plows tend to do in tight, wet ground. Behind the tractor, the furrows opened like something that had been waiting a long time to breathe. By the third pass, one of the men at the fence line had pulled his truck off the road. By the sixth pass, the other one had called a third man on his phone. By the end of that first morning, there were 4 people standing at the edge of that field watching a 1958 plow do something that 3 modern machines had failed to do on that same ground over the previous decade. The clay was turning clean, not smearing, not compressing, turning the way clay is supposed to turn when the geometry is right and the pace is right, and the man behind the controls understands what he's asking the ground to do. That afternoon, the man stopped at the road. One of the neighbors walked over. He was a serious farmer, not easily impressed, with a large operation and opinions to match. He looked at the open furrows for a long time. "What year is that plow?" he said. "58. The neighbor was quiet for a moment. "It's doing that better than anything I've got." "I know," the man said, not with pride, just with the flat honesty of someone stating a thing that had already been settled. The field was fully turned by the end of that week. The following spring it produced. Not spectacularly. The ground still needed time to recover its structure, to breathe and rebuild after years of compaction, but it produced honestly. More than anyone who had watched those previous failures would have predicted. Enough to justify the acquisition cost, or enough to make the following year look promising. The dealer heard about it somewhere along the way. These things traveled in small counties. He never came back out. He never said anything directly. But the story moved the way credible stories do, from one person to the next, acquiring weight as it went, until most people who followed farming in that area had heard some version of it. An old plow, a field no one else could turn, a man who knew something the rest of them didn't. What that dealer saw in the yard that afternoon was iron that had aged visibly. Rust, wear, years of sitting in weather. He looked at the surface and made a calculation. the way people do when they trust what they can see over what they haven't bothered to learn. It is a common mistake. It looks like realism. It feels like experience. But it is often just familiarity dressed up as wisdom. The man with the plow had done something different. He had looked at the object and asked a different question, not what it appeared to be, but what it was built to do, and whether, in the right conditions, it could still do it. That question led to 12 evenings of work, to caliper measurements and spec sheets, and careful attention to geometry, to a solution that was already present in the yard, rusting in the grass, waiting for someone to take it seriously. Old things are not diminished simply because newer things exist. A tool built correctly for a specific purpose does not lose that fitness over time. It only appears to people who mistake age for obsolescence. The 42 acres are still being farmed. The plow is stored properly now, inside, out of the weather. The moldboards greased. It will be used again next time that ground needs turning. No one argues about it anymore. Some things take a long time to prove what they are, but they do not become less than what they are while they're waiting. The dealer said it was scrap. The field said otherwise.